Meet over half of the working world. They are the machine that powers our society, from pouring your coffee and emptying your bins, through to caring for a relative or delivering your parcels. You may see them as essential or frontline workers, or you might not see them at all. Hi, I'm Emily. I host the Invisible Worker podcast. Today's episode is all about the real living wage. I'm here today with Nye Cominetti,
Hello.
Principal Economist at the Resolution Foundation, and the person who actually calculates the living wage.
That's right. Yeah, I turn the handle on the spreadsheets and roll out the calculation. The Resolution Foundation, we're a research organization. We are the ones who actually do the calculation, but we do that on behalf of the Living Wage Commission. As we'll get into, there's lots to talk about when it comes to the detail of it. But yeah, I'm the one who's privileged enough to press go and produce some of these numbers. Yeah.
Before we get into what that calculation actually looks like, because I found it fascinating and I did read your research report on it this year, I wanted to get into a bit of a history of the minimum wage. And this kind of goes all the way back to 1824, where the 1824 Combinations Act was repealed. And once that was repealed, trade unions began to form, and it was kind of the first organization around collective power requesting a wage floor for workers. And kind of through the 1800s, actually the concept of a minimum wage was debated into the 1900s. And I was actually shocked to learn it wasn't until 1998 that the Minimum Wage Act was created, and the UK's first minimum wage was launched on the 1st of April, 99.
That's right.
And I was shocked because I moved here from Canada 20 years ago, and we've had a minimum wage since 1920. And I didn't think Canada was particularly progressive, but there we go.
So the UK did have these things called wage councils. So we used to do some of this on a sectoral level, and that existed from about the 1910s, 1920s, right the way through the 20th century, but then was basically disbanded in the 80s and 90s. So we did have some kind of structure to push up wages for low-paid workers, but definitely nothing as comprehensive as the national minimum wage. So that ended, and then in the late 80s, 90s, there was nothing. And then there was this growing movement for the creation of a national minimum wage, which happened with the new Labour government in 1999.
But not everybody was in favour of this. There was actually quite a lot of debate from economists warning that creating a national minimum wage, so putting a floor on wages, was going to create unemployment, it was going to create inflation, it was going to skew the labour market. How much these arguments hold up? Do you think they're valid?
So they are reasonable questions to ask, and they're reasonable expectations to have a minimum wage if you only ever think about economics in a very, very simplistic sort of supply-demand curve type way. So if you've done any economics at school at all, someone will have told you that if you raise the price of something, people want less of it. Economists have had to learn a lot. In the same way that economists failed to predict the financial crash coming, economists of the minimum wage and labour market failed to understand basically how the labour market worked. And the minimum wage has taught us that it's much more complicated than just this very basic sort of price quantity type equation. And we now know that employers have a lot of power in the labour market, which means that effectively they're paying below what they would be willing to pay. And that means that if you have a minimum wage which pushes up pay, actually they're still willing to hire people at their rate of pay.
Okay.
And that's the basic thing that's happening in the labour market, which was never appreciated in the past. It's easy to laugh at people now, looking back, obviously, with the benefit of hindsight. But yeah, you did have alarmist claims that the minimum wage would cost 3 million jobs. That was what the Conservative Party said at the time of the 92 election when this was starting to be debated. Similar claims from the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. All of those people now, I think, have changed their mind about it. So, you have to say, fair enough, you have updated your views. But yes, it's definitely true that economics has come a long way since the late 90s.
Tony Blair initially tabled a movement for the minimum wage in 92, the Labour Party manifesto. Yeah. And then in 97 actually tempered that a little bit and said, we are going to create a minimum wage, but we're going to create the Low Pay Commission, sort of an independent body that will be tasked with calculating it. Yes. And they'll pull in representatives from business and from other facets of society. So that went live 1st of April, 1999.
Yeah.
And within 2 years, there was a campaign began to bubble up. And there was sort of a famous march on a very rainy day on Mile End. This is a very rainy day today. So I felt some sympathy with the marchers, kind of demanding to pay workers more. So that was kind of the origin story of the real living wage. Can you tell me a little bit more about the real living wage and how it's different to the national minimum wage?
Yeah, it is a slightly confusing world, the different wage structures we have in the UK. The main thing to have in your head is that we have the government setting a legal minimum. So it is literally illegal to pay someone less per hour than the minimum wage. And the detail there is that we have different rates for different age groups.
Yeah, which keeps changing year on year.
Which
the age
keeps
groups
changing.
Keep moving.
As of this year, we now only have a rate for those aged 21 and above, 18 to 20, and I think 16 to 17. Okay, maybe it is a bit more complicated. And then we also have an apprentice rate. So it is still quite. I
think we went from 5 rates to 4 rates. So
yes,
we simplified.
Thank you. That's right. So it is still complex, but basically we have government setting a legal minimum wage floor, and then completely separate to that, but perhaps influenced by, as we can maybe talk about, we have this voluntary campaign, the Real Living Wage, which is run by a charity called the Living Wage Foundation, which asks employers to pay a slightly higher hourly wage rate. And it's calculated completely differently. It's based on an assessment of what an acceptable minimum standard of living looks like. And it's therefore based on what that costs. So it's based on the cost of living. It is in that sense very different to the government's minimum wage floor, where the principle underlying that is how high can we raise this without adverse economic effects happening, be it on employment, prices. And over time that has risen, but it is an entirely different thing to the real living wage, even though some of the language and the terminology is unfortunately now quite similar. So it used to just be national minimum wage, real living wage. And that was kind of easy to understand because you had the word living in one of them and the other one didn't. But in 2016, the legal minimum wage was renamed the national living wage for workers aged 25 and above, which was a completely unhelpful confusion of the terminology. It helped no one at all. It was pure politics. But yeah, I prefer to think about legal minimum wage and then the real living wage, which is the one based on the cost of living. Yeah.
Some early employers began paying what they called a real living wage, calculated based on the cost of living, but that was just in London. And that stayed in London for quite some time.
Yes.
And it wasn't until, if I'm correct, 2011, kind of in the build up to actually the 2012 Olympics, that the real living wage was taken national, that there was kind of a UK rate as well. And actually 2011 was the same time that the Living Wage Foundation was created as an accreditation body for employers. And this is the first year you've actually made a fairly substantial change to the methodology.
So I think that's a good characterization of it. So something that started out as a grassroots campaign 20 years ago has, over that period, become more formalized. There have been more structures placed around it to make the calculation more rigorous, to make it more aligned in different parts of the country. And now the structure that we have is the Living Wage Foundation, who are in charge of the campaign and most importantly in charge of the accreditation of employers. They have within them a living wage commission whose job it is to do this calculation. And earlier I said I get to do some of the handle turning. The Resolution Foundation, we're a research organization. We're the ones who currently actually do the calculation, but we do that on behalf of the Living Wage Commission. And one of the important steps that has happened over that 20 years is that now the methodology that applies to London and the rest of the UK, so we have two different rates, but the methodologies are now the same. So they're different because the cost of living is higher in London, but the methodologies underpinning those rates is identical. So that has been one of the important steps over the last few years. And that wasn't the case sort of earlier on in the campaign. Yeah.
Okay. So kind of the big beats around the minimum wage were 1998 Minimum Wage Act. We got our first floor. 2001, a rainy march on Mile End kind of sparked this drive for a real living wage. 2011, that went national. So the real living wage went national. 2016, the Chancellor announced the national living wage, the government version, which began increasing the size of the minimum wage kind of relative to other wage earners. Similar time that the Resolution Foundation kind of took over that calculation.
It's worth stressing how much bigger the living wage campaign is now than it was 20 years ago. So what started out as this very small thing is now, I think if you go on their website, they estimate about 500,000 people are paid the real living wage, which is absolutely astonishing. It used to be something that, it started out as a few thousand people and several employers. Now, as you say, I think it's like 11,000 employers, 500,000 people. So it really is a big deal. And it's no longer incomparable to the effect of the legal minimum wage, which roughly 2 million workers are paid at that level. So it really is very important. And then the other way of appreciating its success is the fact that we have had this fast uprating in the legal minimum wage.
And do you think that's the maybe awareness piece, or is it also because the numbers are so big?
I think so. I mainly think of it as in terms of placing low pay as a thing on the national consciousness and as a thing that politics should care about. So nowadays, because of those kinds of campaigns, because of the work that many research organizations do, the concept of inequality in various ways is now a kind of essential part of how we think about economic policy making. And I don't think that was really the case 20 years ago. It used to be, here's the budget, the government's policy decisions, what does that do for the national debt? Whereas now, yes, that's one of the things we talk about, but also one of the things we talk about is what does that do for poor households? What does that do for inequality?
What does that do for people?
And what does that do for people? And I don't think that was so much the case 20 years ago.
Let's get into the
detail.
How you turn the handle. I'm not going to ask you to do any maths on the spot, but there was a couple of things that I wanted you to walk me through.
Yeah.
And so the first one is the minimum income standard.
Yeah.
So the real living wage that you calculate is different from the government one.
So you need some way of deciding what level of living standard you are using to create this hourly wage rate, right? So you could say, we only are interested in people achieving a subsistence level of living. We will think about, how much does it cost to buy, 10 kilos of lentils, whatever, every month, like the cheapest possible form of living. And then you could calculate an hourly wage rate that gets you to that. And it would be low, obviously. But I think most people would agree that in a rich country such as the UK, that is not what we should be aiming for.
I mean, lentils are delicious.
Lentils are delicious, and they're a very important part of my diet, but I wouldn't wish them upon everyone every day of the week. And so I think the minimum income standard is a completely fundamental part of this process. And it's also somewhat unique to the UK. Other countries have things that look a bit like the living wage, but I don't think any of them have something which literally does this process of asking the public, what do you think an acceptable minimum standard of living looks like? And that is literally how it works. Every 2 years, the whole process is redone. It takes about 20 focus groups worth of time. And if you've ever done a focus group, you know that doing 20 of them is quite a big undertaking. Each of those focus groups will have a cross-section of society, and they are asked in excruciating detail, what for you is a minimum acceptable standard of living? And the way they do it is they go room by room in the house. And I cannot overemphasize in quite what detail this is done. So they will say, if you have a young child and that young child has toys, will you need somewhere for that young child to put their toys? And they will go into the level of detail. What kind of toy do you think is necessary? What kind of shop would you expect to be able to buy that from? How long would you expect it to last? And therefore, how often do you have to replace it? I mean, the budgeting is incredibly detailed. Or, what kind of breakfast cereal is appropriate for you to be having? But all of this is done on not what do you think is the best breakfast cereal or your favorite breakfast cereal, but what do you think is the minimum that you would be prepared for someone to accept? Some of the detail is probably useful to get a sense of what this is being pitched at. So people are assumed to do some kind of social, cultural activities. As I said, it's more than a minimum, but that is not a very high level of socializing. So, for example, people are assumed to take one holiday per year, 1 week. That's in the UK. So it's not a foreign holiday, which is actually very common nowadays with cheap flights, but it's in the UK, and it's assumed to be in a kind of Travelodge type level of accommodation. So we're very, very far from luxury.
I read the budget for that. It was an £86 train ticket to get to Bournemouth, and £316 for a week stay in a, as you say, Travelodge equivalent accommodation, a 4-minute walk from the beach. And there was some spending money. There was £500 spending money for the week. But then that was offset against the fact that you wouldn't be doing your usual grocery shopping. So kind of you reduce your usual grocery shopping from your overall budget. So it wasn't a very spendy holiday. No. And you could buy a swimsuit, I think, for £20, maybe 15, and you could replace it once every 3 years. And I was thinking that'll be worn out by year 3. You're not going to have much coverage on the beach there. So.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it is so important that this process, because it lends credibility to the whole thing. So you can say, where are these numbers coming from? It's the public that have been asked this question, what for you is an acceptable minimum? One of the benefits of that is kind of baked into the design is that as society becomes richer and expectations rise, that should change. And we want that to change. We're a richer country now than we were 20 years ago. And so people's ideas of what a minimum acceptable living standard is should be different now than they are 20 years ago. And you can see that in the calculation. So you mentioned a methodology change this year relating to hours of work, which we can discuss. But there have in the past been some other changes. So in about 2012, they did all these focus groups and people said, you know what, especially the ones living outside of cities, it's actually probably not acceptable anymore to rely on the bus because that's, really
bus
difficult.
services are getting cut, and
Bus
it's
services are
hard to
getting
get
cut and so on.
around.
And so introducing to that calculation was enough money to pay for a very cheap secondhand car and the insurance costs and so on. So that in that year, I think it was 2012, led to a bit of a bump in the real living wage rate because the public had decided that their view of what an acceptable minimum had changed. And we've seen, similar things have happened, albeit not in quite as significant a way in recent years as well. But that sounds like, oh, why is the methodology changing? But that is the whole point, is that it's based on what the public think.
I can't get over how minimum it is, though. So I spent some time reading through one of the reports, and you're right, it was incredibly detailed. It was 38 pages long, but it was really, really minimum. So, a woman could buy an occasion wear dress for £35 to go to a wedding. But again, that had to last 3 years. Or there was a £100 budget per year for social occasions, for going out for a celebratory drink. Or you could go out for a meal once a month for £35, and that was meant to be a 3-course meal with 2 drinks. And although there was the ability to kind of have some leisure in there, it certainly wasn't, buying a nice coffee every week when you're out walking the dog, or kind of that level of minimum.
Yeah, that's true. And you can see that in other parts of the calculation as well. So when it comes to rents, for example, we need to assume some rent level, and we specifically assume that people are renting at the 25th percentile of the market, right? So that's not a median rent. So that means typically they wouldn't be able to access most rental properties in a given area. They are looking for a cheap rental.
A cheap rental.
Right? So this idea of a minimum but acceptable level, is baked into the whole calculation.
And do you think employers understand kind of how minimum this minimum is? Or do you think there's a sense that on paying the real living wage or the London living wage, that employers think people are enjoying quite a relaxed quality of life? Whereas again, this still requires fairly relentless focus and budgeting.
I'm sure employers are very well aware of the fact that most people they employ, well, depending on the employer, but are paid well above the real living wage, right? So if you just compare it to the wage distribution in a typical company, they'll surely be aware that, okay, this is not a high wage rate. This may be slightly higher than the minimum wage at the moment, and it's maybe slightly higher than we would have otherwise paid some workers. But it's clearly not a high wage rate. But
I just wondered, because, there was some, taking an analogy of the pension space, when pensions auto-enrollment became mandated, most employers went with the minimum amount. And in doing research, I think it was the PLSA, the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association, kind of undertook some research. And employers paid the minimum because they said, well, that was the recommended level. And it wasn't the recommended level, it was the minimum level. And I'm just wondering about that, like the role of a minimum and being interpreted as a recommendation.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the pension is a very good example. So I think the minimum at the moment adds up to 5% in total contributions, whereas most people, we've done similar calculations ourselves, probably you have to be saving on average at least 2 or 3 times that from about your mid-30s to end up with a decent standard of living in retirement. So there, I suppose you're right. There is a danger that if you set a minimum benchmark, you get some kind of leveling down. Employers go, well, I might have considered paying £13 an hour, but someone's just told me that you get a good standard of living on £12 an hour, which is what the real living wage is. So I'll go for that. I hope there's not too much of that happening. I'm definitely not aware of evidence of that, other than the fact that you do see significant bunching at these wage rates, which is another way of saying we know that many people are paid these wage rates. I have always assumed that most of that is people's pay being pushed up.
I would hope so too. It's an interesting one to puzzle around. The other part of the calculation I wanted to talk about is the weighted blend of households. So in calculating the real living wage, you look at 17 different household compositions, ranging from single people through to couples with 4 children. And they each have a need using that minimum income standard of how much they should be paid. And then that's weighted and blended into a single rate. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yes. So in some other countries that have a real living wage type thing, they will just pick one example family type. Typically that would be, a couple with 2 kids, say, and they'll go, we'll calculate the real living wage for them. We try to take a as thorough as possible approach, which means calculating separately a real living wage requirement for, as you said, 17 different family types. By the way, just to emphasize how much, give myself a pat on the back, we also have to do this for the legacy benefit system, the current benefit system, and some other wrinkles as well. A lot of calculating is going on underneath the single wage rate that we end up with. But as you say, your costs are obviously much, much higher as a 2-adult, 4-child family than they are for a single person, right? And so, and we published this, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think the real living wage requirement for some of these large families is in the order of magnitude of sort of 20, 30 pounds an hour.
Yeah.
Like, you really have to be earning a lot to meet all of those costs if you're that kind of family. And that's obviously not surprising to anyone who has kids or got a large family or anything.
In fact, we haven't even spoken about what the living wage rates are right now, but £12 an hour for the UK and 13, 15
That's right.
for London.
That's right. So a very high wage requirement if you're a large family, but comparably a much lower wage requirement if you're a single person. Now, you might think that kind of undermines the usefulness of the whole thing, and I think there's something in that an employer could go, well, I'm paying the real living wage, but maybe they could say, oh, my workforce is mainly, single young people. So why am I taking into account these costs that big families face? And, fine, that's a valid criticism. And yes, in an ideal world, we would calculate, wage requirement for every single worker in the country. And that might be a useful thing to do. But we are, clearly constrained by what a benchmark can do. And that has always been part of part of the thinking of the Living Wage Foundation. They want to have a useful and credible benchmark that actually does reflect the cost of living, but it has to be simple enough to work as a campaign. So that's why you can't have 28 different living wage rates that cover small parts of the country. That's why you can't, I don't think, have a family living wage rate and a single person living wage rate, because the employer obviously would go, well, I'm hiring someone for a job, I'm not hiring them to cover their family costs.
Yeah, it's not on the employer to understand someone's life circumstances necessarily.
And so it might seem imperfect, but I think it is the best that you can do when you're trying to come up with a wage rate that does this job of reflecting cost of living, while acknowledging that these vary very substantially for different workers. But it does mean that if you're in a large family and you're paid the real living wage, you're not going to have a fun time on that wage rate. You're going to be, really hard up. Comparatively, if you're a young single person paid the real living wage, you're doing, I'm not going to say you're doing well, but you're doing better than that large family paid the same hourly wage rate, right? So, but like I said, this is a kind of a difficult part of the calculation that you have to sort of boil it down to a single rate. Yeah.
I found that fascinating, and I took your data and I did some very simple maths, and I kind of broke it down into winners and losers.
Yeah.
So whose wage rate based on the minimum income standard is actually, their need is less than the real living wage, and whose need is greater than the real living wage. Yeah. And for the UK real living wage, that £12 an hour, if you're a couple with 0, 1 or 2 children, you're a winner.
Yeah.
And that was about 48%.
Yeah.
So just around half of the UK, their need is being met using that minimum income standard.
Yeah.
The national living wage, the government standard, if you compared that to the same data, your need is being met if you are a couple with 0 or 1 children. So it's fairly converged right now for the national kind of UK living wage and real living wage. London was a different story. The London living wage, you were a winner. Again, those groups again, couples with 0, 1 or 2 children, but also single people. So single people in London kind of got scooped up. So that gave around 80% winners in London. So if you're a Londoner getting paid the London living wage, odds are pretty high that you're actually doing okay out of that, as in your needs are being met. Compared to if you're a Londoner getting paid the national living wage, that only gave 37% winners. So singles dropped off, couples with 2 kids dropped off. So kind of overall, if you are a couple with 0 or 1 kids, you're generally okay. But everybody else, you're kind of in or out based on where the calculation lands. And so I found that really interesting, and I wonder if that speaks to the history of this, of the campaign as the London Living Wage campaign.
Yeah, these are some of the fun thrills and spills that happen when you try to come up with a single number that reflects sort of very varying needs. So the national minimum wage for workers aged 21 and above is, as of this month, April, £11.44.
Correct.
I want to say. Yeah. And then as you said, the real living wage is £12. So that gap's 56p. In the past, it's been more like £2 up to £3. So there have been more significant gaps in the past. You've got this funny thing where at the moment we've had some quite big increases in the real living wage because mainly we've had such high inflation in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And so that led to I can't remember the exact number, but 10-ish% increase in the real living wage last year. And so that's obviously going to make life difficult for employers that have signed up, that is a big jump in their wage bill. But At the same time, because the national minimum wage has increased so fast recently as a result of government policy, the gap is as small as it's ever been. So in some sense, it's easier than it has ever been before for an employer to go, well, I will sign up and become accredited, because the commitment relative to paying the legal minimum isn't as big as it would have been in the past. Whereas in the past, when you had this sort of £2 gap, it might have meant, a 20% jump in your wage cost for a low paid worker. So the gap is small. Whether or not the gap will remain that small in the future is something we could talk about a little bit if you want.
I do. I specifically want to talk about the shock absorber.
Okay.
Again, in reading about the calculation, there's this concept of the shock absorber, which is if it's going to increase too much, you effectively dampen it. And then that increase plays out over several years.
The reason that there's a shock absorber built into the calculation is because the real living wage rate is affected by many, many things. It's not just what is the rate of inflation.
Yeah.
It's many other things besides. So, for example, government policy on tax and benefits has a big impact on the rates, because what matters for the rates is not just what do you need to earn, it's what do you end up with after benefits have been paid and taxes have been withdrawn. So if the government makes a big change to the tax rate, maybe they slash national insurance contributions, or if they cut benefits, or if they raise benefits. So a couple of years ago, £20 a week was added onto the rate of universal credit. And then it was taken away again a year later. Now, if you sort of immediately fed that into the calculation, the real living wage rate would be jumping around. And that would basically make it untenable as a useful wage benchmark, because employers were saying, yes, I understand that you have to do this calculation, but I can't sort of tie my wage costs to a benchmark which is liable to jump 10% one year, full 10% another year, even though there are reasons why that might be happening. And so because there are those potential sources of volatility in the calculation, this process exists to limit the effect of the size of those changes. And effectively, the rate of inflation plus or minus 3%. So it's fairly simple, and it does its job. So over time, the methodology has shifted towards giving, I think, a more realistic representation of the actual working lives of low-paid workers. So, as I mentioned in the past, there was the introduction of a second-hand car. A few years ago, we allowed for basic pension contributions under auto enrollment. We factored that in as well. And then the calculation had always in the past assumed that everyone worked full time. That is completely not what your typical low paid working household looks like. It's much more common for a household that has children to have one person working full time, one person working part time. And the calculation now reflects that.
And so that's interesting. And this is a conversation I wanted to have with you, which is kind of what is the role of the employer versus what is the role of government? Because even the piece around part time, while I completely understand that change and it is rational and reflects the working patterns of people, often if someone is working part-time, it is because something else is going on in their life, like they're doing unpaid childcare, or they're looking after somebody else in their household, or they have a disability, so for health reasons, they can't work full-time. And so kind of should that be factored into the wage that employers pay, or should, coming back to the early arguments against a national minimum wage, should the government just be delivering more targeted support to those households?
This is sort of firmly in the territory of, political philosophy. What do you think is right and wrong? It's kind of the kind of thing that hard-nosed, handle-turning economists aren't particularly well qualified to comment on. So I'll be speaking here more as a, what do I think, rather than what does economics tell you. Even if you had an incredibly progressive government that was minded to raise the level of support in the UK benefit system, there would still be a shortfall. It is the case that the UK system of income support is incredibly ungenerous. The amount that we give people to help with disability costs, housing costs, or just basic entitlements to pay for food and so on is very low in the UK compared to almost all other rich countries apart from America, basically.
Always the outlier.
Yeah. So in that world, it means that your average working person on a low wage is doing less well than they would compared to if we had a much more generous system of benefits and protections. And an employer could say, it's not my fault that the UK does so badly on social policy. Why is it my job to help people make up the gap? And I suppose my response would be, if you're an employer and you genuinely can't afford to pay the living wage, well, you're probably not accrediting anyway. The living wage is for those employers that are socially responsibly minded and think, yes, we probably can, pay a bit more. It's for those employers in the middle. The very, very high paying employers, they're paying it anyway because of the kinds of jobs that they have. The very worst employers, they're never going to do it because they're just not particularly socially minded. It's all about the bottom line. And for those employers, yes, it's all about, you just need a minimum wage. You need that legal minimum, and that's the only way to go about it. But there are, I would hope, many employers out there in that kind of middle zone where they think, I do want to do right by my workers, and a benchmark is useful, and I am able to lift pay. So they're right to say, if the social security system was better, I wouldn't have to. Correct. But it's not. And it's not going to be any time soon, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's not, for me, a particularly strong argument against an employer doing the right thing if they can.
So this is the world we live in, and I think that's absolutely right. And actually, at WageStream, we understand really deeply the value of investing in financial well-being and kind of reducing the stress for your workforce in terms of how that feeds into overall productivity, overall retention, kind of all of those other metrics. So this was just me playing a bit of devil's advocate and saying, where's the lie of the land? I wanted to ask you one last question. This podcast is all about the invisible worker. So those doing the types of work that maybe we don't see in society, but also often invisible to decision makers. You're deep in this world and you understand this worker really, really well. So what is the one thing about this type of worker? So somebody who is, earning the real living wage and doing variable work potentially, that you wish other people knew. And let me tell you mine, because every time I have conversations with friends and I say, did you know that people who get paid on an hourly basis, their payday shifts because they get paid every 4 weeks? And it's always mind blowing when I tell people this, and they're like, what? How do they pay for things? How do they pay their rent if their payday's always different? And so that's my one thing. What is your one thing? I'm putting you on the spot here.
Just first of all, that's a very interesting thing to mention. And you could argue that UK policymakers aren't very aware of that one thing. When we designed the current system of allocating benefits, the universal credit system does a very bad job of helping people who aren't paid on a monthly basis. So anyway, you're quite right to say that is a underappreciated thing. The thing I would mention is that one way in which your life can be hard is if you just don't have enough money, your income is too low, your wage rate is too low. Another way it can be hard is if those things are unpredictable. And I think I can give two clear ways of showing that. One is sickness pay. So most professional, well-paid jobs, you have an occupational sick pay scheme, which is if you're sick, your employer pays you as normal and says get better, see you next Monday. Most low-paid workers rely on the government's statutory sick pay scheme, which is very, very ungenerous, again, in keeping with the rest of the UK system. So if you're relying on that scheme, your employer is only obliged to pay you £110 a week, but they're not obliged to pay you anything for the first 3 days that you're sick. So that means if you take a week off sick, you would only get £45 in pay. Even if you're a minimum wage worker, that's a really low rate of wage replacement. That's a really sort of serious income shock to be dealing with on top of being sick, right? And that's just not something that those of us who are well paid basically ever have to think about. Another way of getting at the same thing is we did a survey last year where we were trying to get into some of the detail of what does it actually feel like to be in a low paid job? And again, we said, if something happened at home along the lines of, your kid was really unwell and needed help, would you be able to go home to deal with that? And most well-paid people said, yeah, sure. My employer would say, go home, whatever, log in if you can, or, blah, 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 but, go and sort it out. No problem. Most low-paid workers said, no, yes, I might be able to go home, but I wouldn't be paid, right? And that makes sense if you think of that person being on a 0 hours contract or an agency or a shift work type thing. So again, it's just that experience of those things that happen in all of our lives. If you're on low pay, insecure job, that also then feeds through into sort of a nasty wage and income shock, but they don't if you're well paid. There's much more beyond pay that we can do, basically, is a conclusion to make life better for low paid workers.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Nye Cominetti, Principal Economist for the Resolution Foundation and the person who calculates the real living wage. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in along with Nye Cominetti on our deep dive into the real living wage. Before you go, make sure you stay in touch. Please subscribe to the Invisible Worker podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen. That way you can follow along as we release new episodes. Thanks again and see you soon.